what I'd like to do now is introduce our next speaker, Dr. Tony Yeigh. So Tony's a senior lecturer in the School of Education at Southern Cross University and teaches in areas of educational psychology, inclusive education and classroom management. He has a background in special education support and has had extensive consultancies with the New South Wales DUT in relation to the Australian Government Quality Teaching Program. His research interests include school improvement, school leadership, mindfulness education, the use of ICT-based technology, educational wellbeing, and initial teacher education. His presentation this afternoon will report on the application of blended learning in 2 K-12 schools specifically. So in particular, what sorts of skill sets were required from teachers, how it impacted on teachers' ICT confidence, and how it affected student achievement. So a key focus of the presentation will be to deal with why and how schools need to intentionally contextualise blended learning in order to maximise the success. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you very much, and a pleasure to be here. I'm in Lismore, so I just want to say that I do pay my respects to the Widjabul people of the Bundjalung Nation here in Lismore. I'll just share my screen quickly. So I take it everyone can see this presentation here. I've got to move a couple things around on my screen, which I'll just do quickly here. And I'll go into presentation mode so that it should appear a little bit larger on the screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to really talk about the use of blended learning as a response to technological disruption. And probably the applicability of this is been really heightened by the COVID-19 pandemic, really. But I'm going to talk about a blended learning project that was undertaken in Japan between the years 2017 through the end of 2019. So we just finished it at the end of last year. The main focus of this presentation will actually be to examine how to apply blended learning and to identify the relevant teacher skill sets around applying blended learning. So we'll look at defining and positioning blended learning as a distinct pedagogical approach, a teacher's relationship with technology as an instructional tool, their understanding of using evidence to drive their teaching, and teachers' use of inquiry planning. So having said that, I'll just dive straight into it. A few preliminaries. First of all, I suppose a big question for a lot of teachers right now is, to what degree is online learning here to stay? For some teachers, that will be a good thing. For others, not a very good thing. Probably for most, a fairly ambivalent thing. I start off by defining blended learning. Blended learning is quite simply defined as an approach to teaching and learning that's based on the systematic design of face-to-face and online elements. So blended learning is not just about online teaching and learning, it's really about the blending of online and face-to-face elements in a systematic manner. The underlying assumption for blended learning is that creating online and blended environments can no longer be viewed as extravagant or even undesirable. I know there are some people who think that it is quite undesirable to have to use online approaches to teaching and learning. However, the way the world is right now, and not just because of COVID-19, but because of technological disruption itself, as teachers, we have to be prepared to dive into the design of a tech-driven teaching and learning approach, and do so in ways that allow for safe learning and effective learning to occur. What David was just talking about as authentic learning, as it were. That's very possible in a blended environment. The other assumption that we need to recognize around blended learning is that its main focus, the main focus of blended learning, is to increase student control over what they learn, over how they learn, and over where they learn. So again, that really lines up with what David was just talking about before. this is commonly referred to within a blended learning paradigm as student control over the path of their learning, the pace of their learning, and the place of their learning. All of this is to increase student-centered learning. So there's this shift in blended learning from a teacher-centered approach to teaching and learning to not only a student-centered approach, but beyond that to a student-directed approach. That's an important thing to keep in mind. The main issue when we talk about blended and online learning is teachers' use of technology to assist teaching and learning. So there is a certain number of important skill sets that teachers have to become familiar with in order to become effective within a blended learning environment. So we'll just look at those quite quickly. Now, why do I mention teachers' technology? Well, in our project and from my readings around the area of blended learning, this is quite the norm. We went in and we observed. So this project actually involved 3 schools. I think it said 2, but there were 3 schools in a school system in Tokyo, Japan, that was involved in this project. Preliminary observations, one of the things we looked at was how teachers were using tech across the schools, both primary schools and secondary schools. And you can see there that the orange were for primary teachers, the blue is for secondary teachers. And you can see the different ways that teachers were using tech across the school. And of course, the great big bars on the end at both the primary and not far below that, the secondary, is they were not using ICT at all in their teaching. So that was at the very beginning of the project, and it just underscores this idea that there is an important focus on the teacher's use of technology as an instructional tool or as an assistance to their instruction that needs to be sort of focused on as a key blended learning element. Now, because of this, there are certain implications about blended learning that we need to be aware of. First of all, it implies, as noted before, that students will have a degree of control over the time, place, pace, and path of their learning, and that the online part of their learning will take place within school settings as well as at home. The reason that we need to have them work online in school settings in a blended environment is because that's where the teacher can actively problem solve their learning with them. So it is important that in a blended environment, online learning is incorporated into both the face-to-face and online elements of the teaching and learning. The important thing here is that this creates a pedagogical continuum in which at least 2 instructional dimensions are interacting and operating together. The face-to-face dimension, which is more teacher-directed, and the online dimension, which is more student-directed. And also, this involves a second dimension that is sort of goal-posted as being asynchronous, which involves more self-regulated teaching and learning, and synchronous. Now, the synchronous element in a blended learning paradigm involves collaborative learning, and that's both for the teachers and the students. A recent article that just came out about this that I was involved with is noted for you there. And these slides will be made available, etc. So when we talk about these 2 dimensions, we can look at them from different perspectives. They're not just 2 static dimensions, but we can actually activate these dimensions from a number of different perspectives. Here's one sort of visual concept of how we can look at teacher-directed versus student-directed and asynchronous versus synchronous dimensions. And I've put an arrow in here which goes from individual to collaborative, because basically the idea is that as we move through a blended approach to teaching and learning, and students and teachers become more and more familiar with the interactions and the teaching and learning elements that they use for teaching and learning, you will move increasingly from a focus on individual learning to collaborative learning. That just occurs naturally. Now, that's one way of conceptualizing the blended learning continuum and how it operates, or these two continuums, I should say. Here's another one. This one involves looking at these two different dimensions from the perspective of personalized learning and standardized learning, which all teachers have to deal with. You know, one of the conundrums of being as teachers that we have to teach to individual differences, but we have to do so in relation to standardized outcomes. So there are all these sort of dichotomies that we have to work with as teachers. And so another way of conceptualizing this within a blended learning environment is to think of it this way. So teacher-directed to learner-directed, personalized to standardized. So when I talk about these two dimensions of blended learning, I invite you to think about them from a number of different perspectives, how they might be conceived and how they might be visualized as interacting. Two different purposes that you might have as a teacher or as a school leader. And then we have to think about how to apply this sort of conceptual understanding of blended learning. So yes, thank you, Andrew. That's great. Yeah. Yep. Access to devices. Okay. Here's an example, one example of how these conceptual continuums could be applied. So here I've just put down, and you could do this again many different ways. I've just put down particular applications for online and face-to-face learning that could be mapped along two different dimensions here, asynchronous and synchronous, and teacher-directed to student-directed. But again, another way is we could take a step back and look at this from a more macro perspective, and we could look at these two dimensions in relation to specific blended learning models and in relation to specific areas or applications of applied online learning that we could map along these two dimensions again. So at this point, we've simply looked at blended learning conceptually. We've looked at it from a sort of abstract dimensional concept level of understanding. Here I'm trying to get you to see that when you start applying these conceptual dimensions to the classroom, you have to start bringing them down to more concrete, specific, applied instances that will involve ideas, software applications, elements of face-to-face, elements of online, etc. I'll do my best, Addie. I will do my best. So a couple of blended learning models that are very commonly used in the blended learning universe, so to speak, are the station rotation model and the lab rotation. You can see in the station rotation model, what happens is that there is this rotation between different stations. First of all, there's teacher-led instruction, where the teacher takes a group of students and they works with them online. So you could be doing any sort of discovery learning or inquiry learning or problem-based learning using online resources to do this. The teacher leads that. The students will then go break up into groups, and in their groups, they will collaboratively undertake particular activities at a different station. They will then have a facilitator who will work with them and help them problem solve anything from technical problems to particular problems around the unit of work they're learning or the problem they're trying to solve, etc. And they will then go in their homes and individually work online and continue their work, and then come back into the classroom and go back in with the teacher who will actively problem solve where they are. Now you can see that because we're talking about group learning here, there's a large scope for differentiation. And that's really important to personalizing the learning for groups of students and individual students. In lab rotation, there's a similar sort of idea. I won't spend a lot of time going through the different aspects of it, and there's a lot of different blended learning models, but these are two really popular ones. more importantly, I want to get on to the underlying principle of blended learning, which is known as the flipped classroom. So the flipped classroom is a very simple idea, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's flipping the classroom, flipping what the normal paradigm of teaching and learning, where basically students at home are given content to learn, given particular sources of information that they need to familiarize themselves with, and given particular problems to solve or goals, learning goals to start working on, etc. When they come into school, they then practice that learning and they work on projects or problem-based learning, etc., etc. And that's where the teacher can then actively work with them to solve any problems that come up, to answer any questions they have, etc. But basically, the students are now running the agenda. So the in-school learning agenda has now been captured by the students. And they are actually directing their learning journey at this point, or at least increasingly so. And so the teacher basically is relinquishing their role, even beyond that of being facilitator, to really being a sort of adjunct mentor for the student learning, and more of a servant to the student's learning journey than what they were before. So you can see that blended learning is a really radical approach to changing teaching and learning in schools, at least theoretically. In practice, it doesn't always go as far as it probably could, but that's the idea behind blended learning. So now I probably should just change over quickly. I'll try and answer this idea of virtual reality. Virtual reality is not something that I've had a lot to do with. My understanding of virtual reality as it's used in some blended environments is largely to get students to experience simulated learning. And that's, I think, where it really comes into its own. That's probably the best example I can give of the use of virtual learning in relation to simulations and simulated learning. So virtual learning is where you put a headset on and you actually enter a different online environment. How do you see artificial intelligence disrupting the two dimensions? Well, artificial intelligence is going to disrupt. It could bring on a third dimension. I suspect it will, at least initially, artificial intelligence, which a lot of people think we already have, of course, and we don't. What we have at this point is human programmed pseudo AI, but still running along programs that are originally written by humans. AI, when it comes online, and probably that will be somewhere around 2030 to the mid 2030s, will be an intelligence that learns like we do, that learns developmentally and individually, and they will that will form a whole new sentient intelligence that will then exist in the world and will have a completely different basis for making meaning and understanding, and will therefore give us entirely new perspectives on how to do things, what to do, what not to do, etc., etc. The degree to which we empower that voice and work with it, as opposed to try to put it into human service in particular ways, perhaps industrial ways or military ways, is up to us now to be designing and thinking about. So really good questions. And I get that you don't agree we can change the world. It's not easy and not likely something that we can all do. Eddie Wu's an example. Yeah. Look, I agree. I think things like COVID-19 are driving us more to some of these things. And I think that because this breaks the mold, forces us to break the mold in some ways, it will have more influence than it has to this point. I think that technological disruption and online learning elements are only just beginning. Certainly the quality of our resources and our online networks and whatnot is one of the biggest limiting factors. One good thing about blended learning is it allows us to scale up much cheaper and much easier, and that means it allows us to personalize learning much more than we could in the past, and I think that's a good thing. Oh, you guys are arguing amongst yourselves. I'll let you go. I'll keep talking. So designing, let's talk about how to design an active, engaging digital lesson. We need to provide for 3 types of interaction: student to student, student to teacher, and student to content. To do this, we can leverage video conferencing platforms. They're off the shelf, cheap and readily available, such as Google Meet, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, which we're using here. All come with collaboration features such as screen sharing, co-annotation, digital whiteboards, chat boards, such as we're using now, etc. We can also use learning management systems, such as Google Classrooms, Canvas, Schoolology, those are some. So we can do this to have students post, or the teacher can post messages on a daily basis to get students to interact with, and encourage students to post, say, on a class stream or discussion board, etc. The main focus needs to be on formative assessment when you're going to a blended learning paradigm. And this has to do a lot with social justice, to be quite honest, David, because formative assessment is a non-graded formative assessment that allows us to begin individuating or personalizing or differentiating, any of those terms, student learning. That's a real clear aim. Again, this is important because, for example, in our project, in this school system in Tokyo, which is a progressive school system, by the way, when we went in and looked at how teachers were differentiating in their classrooms, we found that for the most part, the teaching and learning process was not being differentiated. And I think this, again, is quite normal. This is not an unusual school system at all. So now I want to talk briefly about the key teacher skill sets that are involved if we're going to use something like blended learning in schools. A really important skill set is understanding how to use evidence to drive what happens in schools and classrooms. And we pose that as what we call teacher as researcher. Here there's what we call the teacher as researcher cycle, where you can see that there is an initial focus on where the teaching and learning needs to go. You need to develop knowledge around that, analyze the knowledge, collaboratively plan for how you're going to move that knowledge forward. Then there needs to be actions taken on that. There needs to be connections made. You need to be doing evaluations. You need to be gathering evidence. You need to be defining your pedagogical goals. All along this TAR cycle, we need to be developing strategies. We need to assign roles. We need to create a dedicated data collection approach. So we need to think about the evidence that is going to help us monitor and evaluate our teaching goals, etc., and then use that data to inform decisions we make about how to refine, change, and improve the teaching that we put forward. So we did that in the project several ways. One of the ways that we helped teachers, actually worked with teachers to help them develop goals for their teaching and whatnot, was to get them to use specific blended learning instructional planning. So they did this at the time where they got together collaboratively in teacher groups, and they worked to form an inquiry approach for their students. This came out of what we called a blended learning schema for the project. So initially, teachers, school leaders, student input and parental input through students to the teachers, along with university advisors. We all got together and spent a week doing nothing but devising a schema for this project. And so we talked about all the different things and all the different ideas that had come in from parents, students, teachers, school leaders, etc., our ideas about research. And we talked this back and forth. We spent 5 full days discussing these things back and forth and put them together into a great big huge Excel spreadsheet, which was, oh, it was huge, dozens and dozens and dozens of columns, hundreds of rows, and each cell in each column and row with a lot of text defining all these different aspects. We revisited that schema several times and finally got it down to a series of strategies that were really just questions here. So when the teachers went into planning, and they had decided, the teachers had decided that they wanted to take a problem-based inquiry learning approach for the project to improve student engagement and student learning. And they got it down to a series of questions that they ask. And each of these questions were designed to help the teachers get together and plan their curriculum and syllabus outcomes according to how those curriculum content and syllabus outcome areas were going to support student inquiry, student agency, and student collaboration. And they used this little map here. This was the end product of all of our schema configurations back and forth to drive their planning. Another key teacher skill set was the use of collaborative inquiry on the part of the teachers. And so here we looked at how teachers, this is just a model that basically tried to capture the way the teachers were working together, and they worked in core team cohorts, you could call them, usually 4 or 5 teachers in a team. Those cohorts worked according to inquiry arrangements, which we just looked at a little bit, and they worked toward core team goals and outcomes. And so we just tried to capture that in this model. But this is another key teacher skill set. You've got to have collaboration going because you're talking about whole school teaching and learning. You're talking about trans school teaching and learning, so that teaching and learning extends outside the school and between schools. You're talking about teaching and learning arrangements that go beyond just the normal classroom situation. Now, time is up. Okay, time is up. I'm through sort of talking about blended learning so much. The rest of this are just resources for remote, online, and blended learning practices. You will be able to get these from the slides. The biggest problem that teachers tend to face outside of resourcing, network access, that sort of thing, is time, how to fit it all in. So here's some ideas about that. There is a particular thing here for remote learning for those of you who may go into remote learning situations and need something like this to refer to. That's really all that there is. And here's my little metaphor for disruption in the classroom. I hope none of you ever have to deal with someone like Russell in that particular type of disruption. Thanks for giving me the time to talk about this. So I hope that I answered any questions along the way, and I'll keep an eye on the chat here in case anybody else has other things they want to ask about.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Tony. I think you were tackling the questions as you went, but definitely keep an eye because I've seen that a few questions come up after the presentation. Now, thank you so much. That was so interesting, and to get that insight of that large study that's been taking place for a long period of time in Japan as well. So really good insight, but really practical, I think, for all classroom teachers as well.